I've really privileged to be able to speak to you all today, and especially with it being Domestic Abuse Awareness Month. So thank you for having me and my colleague Fee. And what I'm going to be talking to you about is the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. And one of the main things that we got from that act is the statutory definition of domestic abuse. So really our starting point is thinking about our current understanding of domestic abuse and what the emerging priorities are in terms of risk and what kind of behaviours we are looking to identify. I'm going to tell you a little bit about SafeLives first of all. You can go onto our website and get access to a lot of our research and resources, and there are some links to our website and social media embedded in my presentation. But really the thing that I really feel passionate about, and I think all of the staff at SafeLives do, is that as an organisation, a domestic abuse charity, a second tier charity, which means we don't provide the frontline services ourselves, but we endeavour to produce best practice guidelines through our training team, through our practice team and our research and evaluation team to advise others, to advise frontline workers across different sectors, including health, police, housing, etc., on how we can really transform the response to domestic abuse for survivors. Our ethos is, or our goal is, to end domestic abuse for everyone and for good. So we really do believe strongly that domestic abuse is not inevitable, and we don't have to accept it as an inevitable fact of life for anyone, and that through robust intervention and prevention, we can reduce and eradicate the rates of domestic abuse. And we're all part of that solution. So that's kind of what we feel very strongly about. It's not just specialist domestic abuse workers, but everyone who may come into contact with victim survivors has a role to play, being part of that jigsaw of a really empathic, trauma-informed and risk-led response, which will reduce adverse outcomes in terms of domestic abuse, reduce rates of domestic homicide, reduce rates of serious injury and harm, and eventually reduce rates of domestic abuse in general, which is what we want. Part of our strategy is that we believe in seeing the whole picture, a whole picture response to domestic abuse. So when we think about any individual who has experienced domestic abuse, that isn't the whole part of their person. They are part of a family, a community. That community is part of society, and therefore the messages that they may be getting, the places that they may be seeking support around domestic abuse, come from various different parts of their life. So they have a family that they're part of, but that family is part of a community, and societal responses are also really important for empowering people to reach forward and reach in and get support. Funnily enough, we're on a bit of a cusp of slightly changing our strategy, because it's that time of year. So this one strategy finishes, another strategy has to begin, and we are building on this. So still very much the whole picture, but what we're now looking to emphasise about, and I can't give too much away lest my manager tell me off, but I can tell you that we're now thinking about what type of response are victim survivors entitled to, what rights do they have to expect from the services that they're accessing, what should services look at providing. So moving on to really empowering survivors to think, actually, this is what you are entitled to when you look and seek for support, and that's what we want to support people to be able to do. So I'm going to that's an easy segue for me into talking about the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. It's one of the really big kind of landmark pieces of legislation that we've had for quite a long time in terms of domestic abuse. And I think the way that leads on from our strategy is that it really did seek to eradicate some of the loopholes that there were around survivors accessing support in various different sectors, and really addressing some of the gaps that there have been in terms of legislation when we're looking at supporting survivors. So it has quite a few different facets to it. It's a huge piece of legislation, and it really is an umbrella term for lots of separate pieces of legislation that here is brought in. I could do a whole day on the DA Act, but we're not going to do a whole day on that, unfortunately. But there are lots of changes, such as non-fatal strangulation being made an offence within its own right, controlling and coercive behaviour, extended so that it includes post-separation abuse. Local authorities now expected to have a perpetrator strategy, so not just focusing all of our scrutiny and all of our action required on survivors, but actually what kind of support or response is there to perpetrators in local authorities on statutory footing. It also established the role of a domestic abuse commissioner as well, who's there to oversee the implementation of various parts of this legislation. But the bit that I'm focusing on for the purposes of our presentation is the enshrining of a statutory definition of domestic abuse. So believe it or not, we didn't actually have a statutory definition of domestic abuse prior to the DA Act. There was Home Office guidance as to what the definition of domestic abuse should include, but there wasn't kind of one definition that we would all now adopt in our services when we're understanding domestic abuse. So the Domestic Abuse Act categorised the different categories of domestic abuse that there might be. And what I think is really, really important about this, and I'm bringing up the categories now, is that it really reflects a modern understanding of domestic abuse that isn't contingent on only the violence, physical abuse and or sexual abuse. When I started off in the sector in 2009, we did use the term domestic violence. And although even as a domestic violence advisor, I would have been aware of lots of these other non-violent types of domestic abuse, the response across the sector was very much built around an understanding that it would domestic abuse includes physical abuse. What we now know is that there are lots of other manifestations of abuse that are really important for us as professionals to be able to acknowledge and identify, and they can be trickier to identify potentially, but as professionals, upskilling ourselves to be able to pick up on where there might be controlling and coercive behaviour, recognising that economic and financial abuse is also a form of abuse, psychological, emotional and other types of abuse are really, really key as well. Not all domestic abuse relationships may not have any physical abuse at all, but what we know from our research into risk and where the real risk lies within domestic abuse, the risk of serious injury, harm on the victim, the survivors and their children, is that it doesn't all lie with just serious physical abuse, that controlling and coercive behaviour is also a really high risk indicator. So it's absolutely vital that as professionals, we understand what it is and that we might be able to identify what some of those signs and symptoms or indicators might be. For the definition to apply, both parties must be aged 16 or over. It's interesting to note this was reduced a number of years ago, about 5 years ago, from 18 to 16 to recognise the research we have as well that suggests that the age group of 16 to 24 are at the highest risk of domestic abuse than any other age group. That risk increases where there is a young person who is pregnant as well. So where we have 16 to 19-year-olds who are pregnant, that is a very high risk age group, unfortunately, for domestic abuse. So now the age in the definition reflects that risk. And for domestic abuse to be made out, we would be looking at that taking place between intimate partners, ex-partners or family members. And I think it's really key to note the ex-partners as well, and recognising that post-separation abuse is a thing. It can be very high risk, the same as when people are still in a relationship. And sometimes that can get lost as well. So the controlling and coercive behaviour legislation that was introduced in 2015 did not recognise that you could coercively control somebody post-separation. It was only under the DA Act of 2021 that that's been rectified and that's been changed. So really, really important part to have that enshrined within the definition. And for our purposes as well, another really key part of this is that Part 1 of the Act provides that a child who sees or hears domestic abuse is a victim of domestic abuse in their own right. So we used to use terms like children witness domestic abuse in the home. That vernacular has now changed. So we would say that children who are in a home where there is domestic abuse are experiencing that within their own right. They are a victim within their own right, because we know that the impact of that on children and young people is really, really significant. Controlling and coercive behaviour, as I say, is really, really important as a key risk factor. It was criminalised in December 2015 to reflect the fact that research shows that it is one of the highest risk indicators in a relationship. What I would say that coercive behaviour is how you get the control. So the two come together, that through coercive behaviour such as threats, humiliation, intimidation, or that's how perpetrators are able to maintain control. And that control can include somebody being deprived of their autonomy, their independence, or the thought that they might be able to escape that situation. Now, if you add pregnancy into that situation as an additional vulnerability, or perhaps something that another barrier to extricating themselves from that abusive relationship, we can see that there are ways, which my colleague Fee is going to talk about, that as in midwifery, we might be in a unique place to be able to identify and respond and have those conversations. Everyone normally gasps when I show them this infographic because it's quite busy. But what this shows is how controlling and coercive behaviour, where that is present within a relationship, can insidiously impact and overlap with lots of other types of abuse as well. So we would be thinking about, when we're risk assessing, when we're having conversations about somebody's relationship, about the risk they're in, thinking about how, if there is that coercive and controlling behaviour that we know is present in a relationship, what are the other ways in which that may present itself or manifest? So is psychological or emotional abuse used as part of that controlling and coercive behaviour? If there is coercive and controlling behaviour, when we think about how somebody might be able to consent to the sexual element of their relationship, that might be another place where those two things overlap in terms of our understanding. And I think it's really important as well, for completeness, that we're also thinking, when we're thinking about the other ways that domestic abuse may manifest itself, that we're also thinking about honour-based abuse as well, which will be something potentially that you might come across when you are working with your patients, with people who are going through pregnancy. Again, we've moved away from the term honour-based violence to be honour-based abuse, to reflect the same kind of trajectory that we had with domestic violence, which is that honour-based abuse is any abuse that is motivated by the feeling that someone has brought shame or dishonour upon their family or upon their community, and therefore that shame or dishonour must be restored, and that can take place via punitive or violent or abusive acts. I think Fee's going to talk about responding in a health setting and how there might be sort of unique ways to identify things like female genital mutilation, for example, and when you're in a health setting, being one of the kind of universal services that people encounter. One of the other things that is a really high priority to be able to identify and respond to in terms of understanding the risk that it poses is non-fatal strangulation. That has been made an offence in its own right under the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. And as we know from research, it is a very high risk indicator. So where someone is experiencing any form of strangulation or choking in the relationship, we would really want to probe more, understand more about how that is happening, and make sure somebody is referred on for appropriate support. I'm not going to read all of those statistics out, but I do want to pick out the one that researchers suggested, that for those that experience incidents of suffocation or strangulation, 9% are pregnant at the time. And when we think about what some of the impacts that might have health-wise, and therefore how that might filter through to impact an unborn child as well, the risk is really, really significant. And that can coincide with coercive control as well, that research has shown that non-fatal strangulation is a common element in coercive control, which results in victims and survivors becoming more compliant in a relationship. It is a red flag. It's important for assessing future dangerousness. It's important for us to, at least as frontline workers, be in a position to identify and therefore refer people on, give them the right information and refer them on to appropriate support services. Again, I don't want to read out all of these statistics on the PowerPoint slide. There was a multitude of statistics I could have picked. I have a whole range of research with various stats that we can pick out about domestic abuse and pregnancy. The most common statistic that you'll hear, which we would endorse as SafeLives, is that around 30% of high-risk domestic abuse either starts or significantly escalates during pregnancy. So we know pregnancy is not a barrier for domestic abuse happening, that women are not necessarily safe when they're pregnant from domestic abuse. One of the key things I want to pick out from this before I end for my part, because this is where you come in, is that 33% of people who'd experienced domestic abuse during pregnancy said they didn't know where to begin to look for help. And feeling ashamed has been found to be one of the most significant barriers to accessing help. That's where professionals can come in, asking the questions, identifying, passing on information and signposting to where people can go for specialist support would eradicate that 33% that don't know where to go for help. If we talk about it more, people will know where to go for help. And if we can help reduce the stigma, we know that will increase disclosures, and that ultimately that's going to keep more people safe. That's all from me in terms of my slides. So I'm going to pass back to Sue.